and welcome to LawPod. I am Lauren Dempster. I'm a senior lecturer here in the School of Law at Queen's University Belfast and director of LawPod. I am delighted to be joined today by Brenda Mondragón Toledo for the mini-series that we're recording as part of the 2024 Irish North-South Criminology Conference. So welcome, Brenda. Would you like to tell our listeners a little bit about yourself?
Thanks for inviting me. My name is Brenda Mondragón. I live in Cork and I just finished my PhD in UCC. I did my research on gender-based violence as a comparative study between Mexico and Ireland, and I used textile as a methodology. But the paper we are presenting here was co-written with Gabriel Mondragón, who is my brother. But we co-wrote this paper thinking of how we can merge our research and kind of, since we listened to each other for so long, how do we get it together? So he just finished his PhD in the Hamburg University.
Brilliant. Thank you, Brenda. So yeah, I just heard you present and it's really interesting research. So the paper focuses on the political myth of state sexual violence in Mexico. But to begin with, could you set the scene for our listeners in terms of sexual violence in Mexico perpetrated by the state?
Yeah, so there is a very strong precedent from the many times that the Mexican state has committed sexual violence against citizens, especially in protest. So in the presentation, I was talking that we could go back to mid-20th century and see kind of the modern Mexican state and how it has used sexual violence. But the problem of it's that in many cases, it has gone underreported. So we don't really have enough written evidence of it, although there is a collective memory that knows that these events has happened. So we start kind of from the 68 and 71, which are the student massacres. At the time, they wouldn't talk about that because sexual violence was not something that was particularly talked as much as today. But it is coming out now that women who survived those massacres are talking today. And it stays there in the collective memory of what happened. But in those, even though it's underreported, there are other three cases, which was Aguas Blancas 1995, Actel 1997, and Atenco 2006. Where it was reported in these massacres and acts of repression that there was sexual violence committed by the state. And Atenco became very important for the recognitions of state sexual violence because it went into the court. So many cases have remained in impunity and there's kind of investigation, but not enough to demand accountability. But Atenco is the case where it went into the Supreme Court of Justice in Mexico to discuss illegal detentions. And in those, 50 women declared their testimonies, 31 declare being sexually assaulted by the police forces. And then it went into the Inter-American Court. And in the Inter-American Court of Human Rights, the sentence did declare Mexico as guilty of committing violent violations to human rights in terms of sexual violence in this protest in Atenco. And it was a very important case because it changed the jurisdiction. So state sexual violence was only recognized in warfare context, where Atenco allowed us to kind of perceive sexual violence committed against civil protests. And it was that recognition, as well as other forms of violence, like medical violence as well, the way that they didn't follow their proper protocols of revision, but also how the body of women were used to convey a message to repress further protest. Because it wasn't affecting only the women, but also the witnesses that were there, but also the broader Mexican society.
Yeah, so can it be kind of considered as a form of state terror almost?
Yeah. In the court, it was looked at sexual terror.
Okay, so just to kind of bring us up to the present then, is this still the case that sexual violence is something that's used by police in their kind of counter-protest efforts?
Yeah, so it is very complicated because, as I said, it goes underreported. So it is still, but it's very hard to know because there's also the terror. It's not only the physical act, but the threats. So there has been feminist protests where feminist groups have been kind of encapsulated by the police and being intimidated or being kind of pushed into alleys without actually causing harm, but it's the psychological threat that goes in, and also from that collective memory of knowing what the police is capable of. So that's kind of what it's also reported.
Thank you, Brenda. So in your research, you mentioned that you used a feminist approach. Would you like to explain the value of that for researching this particular topic?
Yeah, it's very important to have a feminist approach when we discuss sexual violence, because especially this lack of reporting talks about the lack of gender approach in how reports are being done. So if we don't include the feminist approach of recognizing sexual violence as part of the harms committed by the state, we won't move forward in that term. So that's why it's very important that we think about like how feminist research has conceptualized sexual violence, that sexual violence not seen as something isolated, but like something that is systematic, and that it's like embedded in so many different things in society. And this is why the cases of, for example, Atenco is so important, because it recognizes sexual violence not only as the act of rape, but also like how the police would look at them with a sexual connotation, violent language with sexual connotation. And that perspective of understanding it in a broader concept is very important. And this is what feminist research has done. And also because feminist research has also tried to demolish that myth of like the perpetrator as like a psychopath, for example, but like to recognize that it's not, that it is culturally accepted and and continuated by society, and like how norms are established and how it's ignored. And this is why, like, for example, Rita Segato talks about this of like sexual violence being also conveying language, like a language and a message, not only to the victim, but also elsewhere to other people. And the other thing very important is like this work of Rita Segato, for example, on her research on sexual violence, and where she talks about rape as the mandate, the patriarchal mandate, has been very important to demolish that myth of the psychopath, but also has gone into feminist activism. So we see that theoretical development into, for example, the Un violador en el camino, I don't know, from Las Tesis in Chile. It's a video where it's a performance on the street where they dance, and it became viral. So they did it like in many different languages. We actually did it in UCC in different languages. But it talks about that, like how it's sustained by the system, and, you know, it kind of recognizes sexual violence as not individual isolated acts.
Yeah, I think it's really important to challenge that idea that sexual violence is perpetrated by some kind of monster when, you know, many women will have been sexually assaulted by someone who comes across as totally normal, often someone that they know. We can link to the research that you mentioned in the show notes, and we can also put a link into that video so our listeners can see it if they're not already aware. So in terms of this research, you're looking at how this kind of political myth of state sexual violence informs feminist activism in Mexico. And I know we haven't got a huge amount of time, but would you like to tell us a little bit about some of your key findings?
Yeah, so it does inform in this kind of cognitive level that like it creates a collective memory of sexual violence committed by the state, but also it allows resistance and reimagination, and kind of like how can we create counter narratives to demystify the state as a raping entity. So it's very important to look into that as kind of like these counter narratives, and like to look not only, and that's very important also of the feminist perspective of not creating ideas of victimhood, you know, and like something very important is to recognize that in Mexico, there's a lot of resistance. Right, it's not just oppression and victimhood, but like there is a lot of resistance, and the feminist movement constantly like creates counter narratives to demystify and to kind of to lose the power. So like, you know, bringing it to the court case, but also in like protest and how protests have happened, and that they organize that rage that we all have from these abuses. And it goes into the protest that like sometimes they can be very, I don't want to call it violent, confrontational against the police, or the police in the protest, but that they are fighting that myth and that resistance. But then when it becomes very confrontational, there's the state and the media have the power to develop another one, another myth of feminists as rioters, and that, and then becoming the protectors of the society and the city, and kind of turning around the problem, which is the state sexual violence, and turning it against feminists as rioters. And so how there is like this ongoing negotiation between the feminist movement and the state and so on. So it's really interesting to see that. And from my own research, it was so important, that the resistant part.
Yeah, can I ask you a little bit about how the police are viewed in Mexico? So I guess this maybe relates to the myth part, but like, could you say a bit about how the police are perceived in Mexico, and in terms of whether or not they're perceived by the general population as being protectors of society? And how does that kind of play into this?
Not really. It's actually the opposite. And because the myth of the state, obviously, is that the state is there to protect its citizens, and the armed forces are there to protect the citizens, from other. But in reality, because of all the atrocities that the state has committed, it has lost power as us being able to see them as something that is protecting us. But they are protecting themselves. Like, they are protecting the state. They're not protecting the citizens. So there is this idea. Like, I would say that a lot of people in Mexico would not feel safe and being protected by the police because of all these violence that they have committed before. So it's really hard to see them as a power, a protection. Same with the militarization that is going on at the moment in Mexico. It's really hard for everyone to understand, to see that as a protective measure. It's not. It's really, we know from historical background that they have committed violation to human rights, and that this militarization going on at the moment is continuing, that especially against them in the southern border with Central Americans, for example. So they wouldn't be perceived as protective.
So obviously, Brenda, your research has focused on Mexico, but could you tell us a little bit about the kind of international picture here?
Yeah, what we think that this work can do is that it can broaden the perspective of, firstly, because Mexico is not the only state that commits state sexual violence. There's so many other countries, and we know it. And we know about like strip searches. We know that it happens in different places. It happens in Ireland. So if we are proposing something that can help to understand not only Mexico, but other countries' dynamics of the state and the police. So that's our aim. And I think that's why the Inter-American Court sentence is so important on the Atenco case, because it does set a precedent, a legal precedent in an international court that should have reached to many other countries as well.
Thank you, Brenda. I think that's really important given, the rate of sexual violence globally, but also the increasing pushback we're seeing against protests by some states as well. So thank you to you and your brother for doing this important research. So I'll bring the episode to a close. Thank you so much, Brenda, for joining us. I will link to resources that Brenda has mentioned in the show notes if any of our listeners want to read anything further. Thank you very much.
Thanks for inviting me.